Who made us flawed? Who made it the case that we
Right.
couldn't fully understand this?
Right. So once again,
Right. So we didn't, it's not about free will. And I don't believe in free will, but I don't think that free will is in the same ballpark as what we're talking about here. We're talking about the ability to understand this message efficiently.
even if, so let's play hypothetical. God gives a perfect inerrant word. He also endows people with free will. Are there people that would take that book and manipulate the book so that they might gain certain authority?
Thanks for proving my point.
Okay, first of all, again, you're not addressing the question that's being asked. And regardless of that, I'll answer your question. Yes, people probably would do that. However, that's not what we were talking about, and we're not going to change the subject to that. What we were talking about was this being the method used to understand it. You're saying God wants everyone to understand this. That's your belief, right? God wants everyone to accurately understand this. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, but he chose a way which is insufficient.
I would disagree that it's insufficient.
Okay, but you disagreed with my criticism of the telephone game, and you accurately answered when I asked you what was wrong with the telephone game. And what I'm saying is you got the answer right, but the answer applies to this too.
So the question was, how can it possibly be sufficient if there are two honest, devout, sincere individuals who want to know what God thinks, who read the book and don't agree?
Because a person doesn't have to intentionally misinterpret it. Like, somebody doesn't have to intentionally say that the Bible says something it doesn't say, translate it inaccurately. A person can mean to do it honestly and make errors.
And if the tool for communication to those two individuals is ambiguous or subject to interpretation and misunderstandings among even honest people, how could you ever say that it is sufficient for the task that you set it to?
Well, you could say that it's sufficient to the task that it's said to, even if you had honest individuals
No,
who disagree.
you can't, because we've started with.
Is it just the
I swear I'll just drop you.
Just drop me then. Do what you got to do. I don't care.
I will, you little punk ass, but because I know you won't hang up, I'm gonna put you on hold and make you listen. Now I own you. You're on hold. The purpose, as acknowledged, was for God to communicate to everyone. You already acknowledged that. Oh, he hung up. Sorry. You already acknowledged that the purpose was for God to communicate this message to everyone. Okay? That's step one. God wants to communicate to everyone. That is the task. The only way the message is sufficient to the task is if the message is clear enough that everyone can understand it. After that, you can get to willful disregard. You can get to willful changes. But you cannot take two people who, like, if Shane and I are studying a book on music theory, and we look at it, and we both really want to understand music theory, and we have the same text, and we look at it, and we come to two dramatically different understandings about it.
Which has happened with us with interpretations of the Bible. There are verses that we disagree on what they mean.
Yeah.
But we're reading not only the same book, the same translation.
And so if that's the case, then you could say one of us is just not very bright or very wrong. But you can't say that it's an exercise of free will that one of us is intentionally trying not to understand it.
Right.
But if there's a God, and that God is capable of making both of us understand this correctly, and instead of taking the method that is sufficient to ensure an accurate understanding for each of us, instead uses a demonstrably inferior method such that we don't come to a correct understanding, it ain't our fault. If you write a book that's not good enough for the very thing that you're trying to teach, that's your fault. And if you make an argument that is insufficient to demonstrate your case, that's your fault.
And back to my teacher analogy, if a teacher gives a lesson and every student in the class gets a different interpretation of it, you blame the teacher.
Yeah.
So,
But the other thing about his analogy that's great, that fits in there, is, if you were to teach 4 of the students and have them instruct everybody else, that's a lazy fucking teacher.
right.
That is somebody who's not doing their job. And if one of the, like one of the 4 students taught another person and they understood it, cool. We're not saying you can't do that.
Right.
Maybe everybody in the class could understand, but it's clear that we have an issue where not even the 4 people necessarily agree, and the rest of the class doesn't come to the same understanding. And you're going to say, it's that class.
Yeah.
It's their free will.
And if they start killing each other over who got the right answer, then I think it's the teacher who should be held responsible.
Absolutely. All right. So that was a really long call.
This is the big conversation. Underneath me, Justin Briley, taking you a series of shows exploring faith, science, philosophy, and what it means to be human, in association with the Templeton Religion Trust. Welcome along to the show. Today we're debating morality. Can atheism deliver a better world? And the big conversation partners I'm sitting down with are Matt Dillahunty and Glenn Scrivener. Matt Dillahunty is a well-known voice in the world of atheist activism. He hosts the Atheist Experience call-in show and leads the atheist community. Glenn Scrivener is my other guest. He's the director of Speak Life, an organisation using modern media to bring the Christian message to a secular world. Glenn's videos have reached millions of people and often defend the Christian worldview against the atheist worldview. So today we'll be looking at the modern atheist movement. Can secular morality provide a better foundation for society than Christianity? And as people search for meaning in an increasingly post-Christian West, can atheism deliver the grounding needed for living a moral life? Glenn and Matt, welcome along. Great to have you both. We're really looking forward to this. I've even donned my glasses. You can barely see me, but I lost a contact lens the other day, so these are my backup.
You look
pair.
very studious. It's very
Thank you. I hope to bring some gravitas to the programme.
Craig, you're at my glasses if I need them.
It's all right. No.
Without number 10.
Look, it's a real delight actually to have you here in the UK with us, Matt. You don't get over here very often, but I've seen you many a time doing YouTube videos and you're speaking and lecturing and so on. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You began an atheist community out in Texas. Why did you do that? What was the reason behind it? Why did you start a call-in show about atheism?
Well, I didn't actually start the show, although that's a common misconception. I grew up Southern Baptist. My parents thought God was preachers and people in my church, which was an interesting story when I did a debate against Mike Licona. He showed up.
Oh, really? From your former
30
church?
years ago,
Wow.
we thought you were going to be serving the Lord. What happened?
Okay.
But I found my way out of religion while trying to be a better Christian. Essentially, I thought that God was punishing me in my tech job because I hadn't been a preacher like he wanted. And so I said, okay, that's what I'm going to do. That the story led to me eventually realizing I wasn't a Christian, couldn't be a Christian. And search for what else might I really call myself. The atheist community of Austin has been around for 20 years, and they started the Atheist Experience TV show, and it wasn't live. It was kind of recorded conversations. Eventually, it became a live call-in show, and I joined in 2005, which coincides with YouTube and everything else. And so that's when the show blew up and became something more interesting. Although, maybe I had a little something to do with the popularity of the show.
Well, and I think your face through it has become very well known, if you like. I don't know if you think of atheism as a leader. What's your view? How atheism portray itself to the public?
Yeah, I tend to draw a distinction. I mean, atheism from a purely philosophical position is just not the good. But there are movements that are tied to atheism. There's a lot of discussion and debates about what is atheism, and of course, like any other movement, There's infighting and there's division, but I always viewed that as a positive. Because when your group is big enough where you just split in two over a disagreement, then you're probably doing something wrong. Because until then, it's just a handful of people sitting around patting themselves on the back for not believing in God, religion, government, things like that. And we moved on beyond that. Even if you just look at the atheist community involvement programs that we're using now, for years it was the Atheist Experience, the premier call-in show, and it still is. And then we had Nonprofits, which was a pre-recorded kind of political discussion about separation of religion and government, and Godless Bitches for a while, which is going to be making a comeback, but talking about women's issues and things like that from a secular perspective, because a lot of that gets lost. We work with Foundation Beyond Belief, which is a secular charitable organization, and Recovering from Religion, which was founded by my friend Darrell Ray. And we often direct people to those resources because when people are finding their way out of religious belief, that's not trivial and it's not easy. And there are people who describe it as like everybody in my family may have well just died because now they're no longer there and I'm grieving this. There's a lot of issues surrounding that. And so we're producing more and more programs to kind of address the whole person so that it's not just, let me call in and argue with you about it.
Sure. I mean, what you're describing sounds almost like an atheist media. Are you the equivalent of the atheist TV evangelist? Or, is that your fault?
I hope not. I think I operate considerably differently because it's not so much that if you watch the televangelist, what I see is there's communication coming from ours instead is call it person. Somebody calls in and tells me what they want, we have a discussion. Sometimes it gets heated, sometimes I can be awful. I can be arrogant, condescending on occasion. Sometimes I hang up too quickly. But a lot of it is, it's all genuinely an attempt to, all right, let's figure out where our disagreements are. It's just that people with our call-in show, I'm not dealing with somebody who spent their life studying it, somebody who has some expertise in this. It's just the average believer most of the time. And because of that, they can't often distinguish between attacking a belief and attacking the person who holds the belief. And so even when you're not attempting to make anything personal, it might still be taken personally. It's a fine line to walk, and nobody's going to get it right all the time. But I think it's been incredibly valuable, not just in the fact that we have thousands of people who would say, hey, I'm an atheist now or I'm a skeptic now because of what you've done on the show, but also because there are plenty of Christian apologists and preachers that I've made friends with over the years who still value that kind of conversation.
Sure. Yeah, well, we're all about having the conversation here as well. So it's great to have you on the show today. Glenn, great to have you as well.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit of your background. You kind of grew up in a Christian setting. Was that always the case? Or?
Yeah, grew up in a church-going home. And I think during my teenage years, though I went to youth group and was the kid with the hand in the air getting the answers right. If you stick with Jesus, you're kind of onto a winner. Internally, I kind of had this idea that God was a large being far away, watching and waiting to spot my mistake, and found myself less and less compelled by that vision. And I think by the time I went away to university, I was pretty much done with Christianity and didn't want to really have anything to do with church or that sort of thing. But I think towards the end of my university career, studying philosophy of religion and ethics and meta-ethics and these sorts of things, and starting to think through why the intuitions of my heart that love is the greatest thing and that a life of love is the greatest value, and a friend who was challenging me to read through the Gospels and get back to the heart and soul of Christianity, Jesus Christ. And I remember reading through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and just thinking halfway through Luke's Gospel, if God's like Jesus, I'm in. And so that was a real turning point for me, aged about 21. And I kind of jumped in with both feet at that stage and really started loving church, having hated it before, and started loving getting into conversations, the way that Matt loves getting into conversations with people. I then found a graduate job afterwards that I was not very suited for office work, and then discovered that you could do this thing for a living, and started working for churches since the year 2000, and I've been shooting my mouth off about Jesus ever since then.
Yeah, and that's kind of what you're here to do, in as much as you're here to engage with Matt on atheism. Can it deliver a better world within a tradition of morality and passion? What about the atheist movement as a whole? I'll tease that out at the start of the show. How have you seen it develop? As a Christian, gave you a secular world, different forms of atheism.
I guess there's not one atheist greatest book, the 7 types of atheism. Sort of, puts paid to the lie that there's only one way of being an atheist, or one kind of metaphysical outlook that you could describe as atheism. But I guess what I've been very used to in the last 20 or so years, maybe a bit less, is what's being described as the new atheism. I remember debating Andrew Coxon, the chief executive of the British Humanist Association, who has been on this show a number of times, I believe, and I was debating him in Oxford. I guess this must have been about 8 years ago, and the crowd was vibrant and pulsating, and it felt like lions thrown to the Christians thrown to the lions. It felt very much like I was in a minority of one. The whole room that was very much a daunting crowd.
You felt that was the overwhelming kind of feeling backing that kind of atheism.
In that moment, that it would be a better thing if religion ceased to exist. And then what was interesting is Facebook reminded me of the time hop thing, reminded me 8 years ago you were in Oxford, and I happened to be in Oxford last year doing a Buddhism. And I happened to see a number of people from an atheist and the atheist community, like the skeptic was there, and a number of people who were at the debates that I was at 8 years ago. And suddenly they were listening to Jordan Peterson. It was a very different voice, a secular voice still, although he has a much grander place of religion in society. And it made me see that things have moved on, right? And there are other strands to this. You start reading people like Jonathan Haidt, you start reading people like David Sloan Wilson, and they again have a place for religion, even though they themselves might be atheists. And so I think it's a mistake, and sometimes Christians make the mistake of thinking that every atheist is Richard Dawkins. And yet he is one brand of one kind of atheism, and really you need to have a better conversation with people. You need to figure out what they actually believe. I could assume all sorts of things about Matt's metaphysical beliefs without ever having actually interrogated them. And I think that's what's really great about having a conversation. But what do you actually believe about morality, metaphysics, morals?
It's interesting you talk about, essentially, I would think you would be describing the tone of things 8 years ago versus this. And while I don't look at it as if there are different types of atheism, I look at it as, atheism is a thing, but there are different atheists, and they're going to have different ways of doing things, but also just the general tone of things is going to change. In the United States, around the time that Sam wrote End of Faith, and there was, the initial rise of what was called new atheism, which annoys a lot of us because it's not new. It's, I guess, a new activism on behalf of
I think that's what was new about it, was that maybe the tone and the way it was being put across. In fact, that the internet was not used.
Well, we were also, at that time, Bush was president. There were concerns about evangelicals encroaching on government. And then there was that ramp up, and then Obama becomes president. And, we legalized same-sex marriage, we do a bunch of stuff with it. And not that all atheists are remotely liberal progressives, but there's a good chunk of them that are in that category. And so we were having conferences. I think I did 12, 13, 14 conferences. That sort of died down. And there was concern that people, atheism has had its heyday and now they're done. And I think really what happened is that the environment we were living in changed, and now there were other things to worry about. You didn't feel like there was this encroachment of religion in your life as much. And that has shifted, of course, since Trump was there. But the tone and how people are doing things changes. And, I can look back on the early days doing the show, and I was right. And now there's a lot less of that.
You're a bit more chilled out.
But yeah, there's tons of. I think we need a number of different approaches because, first of all, not everybody believes for the same reason. They're not going to give it up for the same reason. And if I'm going to be trying to educate myself on which believers are going to give most compelling, justifications for their belief or the best descriptions of the worldview they want to have, then I have to go into without doing I'm right, you're wrong. Not nearly so much as I'm just not convinced. Can you convince me? We end up having much more conversations, stringent conversations about epistemology and what is in fact justified. Even if it turns out we agreed on the actual political positions and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, sticking with the atheist movement, I think there are those who want atheism just to be that negative. And others who do see it as allied to a whole set of evidence about redemption, and what's your view? Where do you feel like
I don't think so. Once you identify as an atheist, I just stick with that label. You're not convinced. God doesn't help you about it. But it's undeniable that, like, for example, the Atheist Community of Austin has a list of position statements. I know because I wrote them, and it took me quite a while to get the board, the directors on board with us having position statements. I wasn't redefining atheism. I was defining what the atheist community of Austin is, and what our group was going to be. And this is why the simple answer to the question, which can atheism lead us to a better world? No, it can't. If you're looking at atheism as just that. If you ask, can secular humanism, can these kind of values that we're packaging together that we care about, that happen to be held by some atheists, they're not exclusive to atheism at all. I don't require that everybody I spend time with agree with me. And I don't assume that just because somebody shared a stage because I shared a stage with Dawkins. There's plenty of people who have problems with him. I shared a stage with Harris. I shared a stage with Jordan Peterson. Those were different, though. If Sam Harris and I are sitting down together, the presumption is, these two are in alignment and in agreement, which is true most of the time. There are things that Sam and I disagree about. When I sit down with Jordan Peterson, the assumption is, this is the head-to-head debate. And the interesting thing is that I don't know Glenn at all. And there are people who are going to assume, this is the big battle. But I don't look at debates or these kind of discussions as if they're WWE events. This is a genuine conversation. I find myself challenging people in the atheist community far more often than I'm, having conflicts with people who are religious.
Which is a great attitude to have. But I think these days what we tend to see is cancel culture. What we tend to see is if you've got any views about it, a prescribed set of views that have only really arisen in the last 5 minutes. If you don't toe the line on a number of different orthodoxies, and I use that word advisedly, orthodoxies, then you're put outside the camp. Again, I use that word advisedly. It's very religious language.
It's yes.
Which partly, I think, where the interest is coming for folks like Peterson, Douglas Murray, and Weinstein, and others who are social intellectual about that, who are perhaps pushing against what some people see as this sort of politically correct. From a secular point of view, and I find that there's some interesting bedfellows then between Christians who find themselves on the same kind of side as those guys, and they may be set against other secular people who are far more progressive in their views and that kind of thing. I mean, it is an interesting sort of time at which there's a whole new set of questions that are being put on the table.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the ineradicability of a religious spirit to humanity. Okay, and I do think that one of the things that I think has sort of marked out the new atheists, if we want to give any labels to anywhere, would be the belief that it would be a better thing for society if far more people were religious. And I think that certainly captured the four horsemen of the apocalypse, of the atheist apocalypse. Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and Harris. They certainly wanted to see people deconverted from Christianity in order to see a more flourishing and better world. But I kind of think Dostoevsky was wrong when he said, when there is no God, everything is permitted. I think what we're seeing is when there is no God, everything is very puritanical, and everything becomes actually even more heightened in its moralism. And I think what we've found is getting rid of God at that level of public discourse, it's actually led to people pronouncing anathemas on people and burning them at the stake and going on witch hunts.
See, and I don't think this is actually so much tied to atheism. So what I see a lot of is people are talking past each other, and people on both sides of an issue are engaged in hyperbole and perhaps not the most honest assessment of what they view as the opposition. But the sort of thing that Glenn's talking about, it's not as if atheism is the foundation behind cancel culture or whatever they say.
No.
It is political ideologies and people who have its, I will brook no disagreement and I am not interested in conversation. If you said this, you are done. And if you're willing to associate with somebody who said this or whatever, then you are also. That's not even an atheist thing.
Yeah, no,
that's
certainly
humans.
Exactly. It's human nature. I think someone like Jonathan Haidt would say in The Righteous Mind that we all orbit around these little totem poles of highest value, and those totem poles bind and blind. They bind together communities, but they blind us against what the other communities are saying. And therefore, an atheist community can be just as religious in that sense as a Christian community, Muslim community, because we all have these highest ideals. We're all involved in motivated reasoning. We all have our in-group. We all have our out-group, and we can all engage in behavior that is more or less tolerant of one another. And then the question becomes, well, how do we relate to and the one thing that then rules out is you can't then have a irreligious society.
Yeah.
Is that a fair comment, though, that atheism in that sense is like against the press?
So I'm always going to push back on this atheism thing, just as far as the label, but yes, we do kind of close. Of course, because they're human, and this is what humans do. My only concern with religions at all is there any good reason? I would not, people will say, oh, religion's never done anything. Well, religions have done lots of good things. Right? Actually, more accurately, people who are religious have done good things. That would be true as much for secular people as well if it weren't for a disparity in the sort of privileged position that religion has had and benefited from for all these years. Secular organizations had to do a lot more fighting and in a lot more recent time just to get a similar status. For example, tax exempt status in the United States. It's just, if you're a religion, as long as you're one of the recognized religions, you're just granted it de facto. We're a Baptist church, we're a Catholic church, we're a Unitarian Universalist. Even the Buddhists had to fight for property tax exemption in Austin because it wasn't on the list of approved religions. The Satanic Temple just recently got approved by I'm pretty sure it's the IRS, religious organization, tax exempt status. And that always seems strange to me. I realize I'm in the UK talking about American politics, but I've always had a problem with the notion that in the American Constitution, the United States Constitution, where we get to this notion that you are tax exempt because you're a religious organization is part of the conflict, and it puts the government in a strange position of saying, hey, you're a church, you're not a church. How do you allow that decision to be made at the government level and not come to the conclusion that there's a necessary problem there with entanglement between religion and government? Religion can decide or the government can decide which religions are tax exempt.
That was a big issue with Scientology.
They fought like
a big battle to be recognized. I mean, obviously sometimes there are differences between one side and the other. But it's interesting that Matt is willing to say, yeah, and for all intents and purposes look rather than
Well, I mean, to the point of why churches have tax exempt status. I mean, there's a big debate going on in Australia, where I'm from, right now, about that very question. I mean, one of the issues to throw into the mix is that there is no evidence for religions to flourish in society. So when you look at the studies, you see that those who have an intrinsic religiosity, that is, those who identify as religion is the most important thing to me, it helps me to frame the rest of my life. If you ask those people on any kinds of measures of reproduction, how many babies, longer life, are you happy? will you have more of a resistance to depression, to recovery from illness, recovery from surgery? Do you have a resistance to divorce, to suicide? There are any number of factors where an intrinsic religiosity, that is, a body of people who are saying that their religion means the world to them, those people thrive in a world where if the government was able to put that into the water, if they were able to put a magic elixir into the water that could deliver those benefits, longer life for goodness sakes, happier, healthier, they give more money to charity. They give more money to secular charities than secular people do. They give more time to secular charities than secular people do. They give more blood than secular people give. All these things have been demonstrated in thousands of studies. So, throw that into the mix as a government is looking at what will lead to the flourishing of society, what could make society better. Actually, intrinsic religiosity is something that could definitely do that. So,
and see, here's where we get to disagreement. But it's going to be difficult, because I don't have access to go look at studies and everything else. But if you do a Google search for religiosity versus societal health, there's a study that was done years ago that was in the Journal of Religious Education. I'm going to get the
2005. Gregory S. Paul.
Yes, Gregory S. Paul.
Yeah,
which
paleontologist.
Shows something different. But in any
he's
case,
a paleontologist who was actually hacked off with creationists. You go to Wikipedia and you find Gregory S. Paul.
But that's all about Gregory S. Paul. I'm talking about his data.
You've been quoting him for 15 years, though.
I know, but I'm quoting his data, not him.
Yeah, but he's one study against thousands of others, and he swims against a tide of literally 89% of the studies show that everything goes in the other direction. He did a univariate analysis about secularity and how it relates to public benefits.
Sure, and I'm not saying that
and he cherry-picked his results.
Oh, all right. Well, see, now we're in a different thing, because if we're going to start making accusations that his study's not wrong, or is not good because he cherry-picked it, I have problems with the other studies.
I'm not aware of the study, so could you just explain what's in the study, just so that I?
Well, that's the thing. Without
saying
this isn't what I came in prepared to discuss, so I don't want to get the study wrong. The point I'm making is that
you've been getting it wrong for 15 years.
I've been getting what wrong for 15 years? What his study says?
His study is a univariate analysis of how secularity within European countries is indexed to a whole different number of things, like murder rates and that kind of thing. He didn't look at other things like crime rates and that sort of thing, because it didn't help his analysis.
Sure,
so
you are pointing to problems that you have with his methodology, but that's not me getting wrong what his report says.
Why are you camping out on his study when literally there are thousands of studies that show the benefits of religion?
Well, I was getting to that a minute ago.
Okay.
Because a number of the things that in the studies that you would cite, I would also have a problem with their methodology. Because when you talk about, first of all, you've got the issue of self-reporting. How happy are you? And we know, for example, especially from ex-Mormons, that groups like Mormon culture encourage people to, because they are representatives of the church, to present themselves as happier when less problematic. Now, who knows what the actual truth is there, and I'm not saying what the truth is. What I'm saying is there's an issue with self-reporting. There's also an issue with what is the real foundation here. Is it that they are religious, which, by the way, is independent from the truth of the religious proposition? That's why the challenge that I had for years was show me a real, true benefit of religion that is necessarily only produced by the truth of that religion. Because you can produce those same things with a compelling lie. If you've got 5 religions and only one of them is true, but all 5 of those people, religious individuals or people who are adherents to those are reporting that they're better and happier and these other things, then it has nothing to do with the truth of the religion. It has to do with who we are. And it may be the case that what people need is the community, which religions have done a really good job of building those communities. And it's one of the things that secular organizations are working towards doing now, building stronger communities. But we had to fight for just the right to exist and be open and talk about this before we could get to a point of building those sorts of communities.
I mean, it's interesting. We've gone to this area of what is the value of religion, Christianity specifically, I suppose, in your case, Glenn. I mean, are you saying that the science seems to suggest that actually there's something about doing the things of religion, whether it be the community aspect, but also, I suppose, the ritual, the belief, the prayer, that is in some way we're kind of made for, in some way psychologically, that is our natural state, whereas you don't think that's the case with someone who adopts an atheist perspective on the world?
I think you can go there and you can make the argument that this seems to fit the human person better, therefore it might be more likely to be true. You could go there, but before you even go there, I think it's important that this difference between intrinsic religiosity and extrinsic religiosity is kind
Just
of
explain what
teased
those
out.
two terms are.
So, intrinsic religiosity is you don't treat religion like a means to an end. You know, so your wife goes to church, and so you go to church too, just to keep her happy. You know, that would be extrinsic religiosity.
Okay.
Or you like the community, or the pastor's not such a bad guy, and you guys go bowling on a Friday, and that's fine. That would be extrinsic religiosity. But the key question that would identify you as intrinsically religious would be, this is the most important thing to my life, or this is what helps me frame the rest of my decisions, or that kind of thing. And it's that seems to make the difference. So not just that you have community, but that you seem to be oriented towards something that is higher, something that is transcendent. That seems to give that added effect.
And I wouldn't even dispute that.
Okay.
We do some funny things with language. When people are like, "Oh, you don't believe in anything higher than yourself," and I'm like, "Well, what do you mean by higher? Do you mean that not that I'm just basally selfish? You know, Matt is the superior. There's nothing higher than Matt." No, because there are things that I value. There are things that I would sacrifice my time and energy for as well. There are folks who come, for example, to the atheist community of Austin, where this community has saved their lives. People who were suicidal, who were ostracized by family, who felt alone and everything else. And it has become essentially the most important thing to them. I think one of the differences is that I try to make sure that we're discouraging any sort of like, but I wouldn't deny or even object to the notion that the sorts of things that you're describing as religiosity are important to humans and may in fact be beneficial. My objection is to whether or not there's actually a truth behind that, an actual God thing. If it turns out, I used to irritate some atheists because I would say, I can prove to you that prayer works and I can demonstrate it right now. Because if you're in a cave-in and you pray, you are more likely to be rescued. Not because there's some God listening to answer that, but because prayer has a calming effect on you, which extends the amount of time that you can be trapped, which extends the likelihood that you can be rescued. The question then becomes, if you know that it's the calming that extends the amount of time, could you do the same thing with meditation? Or does the awareness that it's the calming somehow eliminate the benefit of it? And that's the thing that I think we don't know.
I mean, are you interested in a sense, though, like the New Atheist Project to some extent, in deconverting people, getting them out of those beliefs? And if you do, do you run the danger of actually creating a worse kind of life for them, because actually they may not make that transition into a secular version of the well-being that religion may have given them up to that point? I mean, it can be quite a really harsh process, you know, deconverting. It can be terrible.
And one of the things that we see undeniably within some people who leave religion, who identify as atheists, is they often fall into nihilistic kind of, I wouldn't say often, occasionally fall into. Some of us don't have any issue with that at all. And so it's not I'd never pretend that there's no problems or anything else. First of all, I don't go door to door. Hey, have you stopped believing in Jesus yet? I can fix that. We take incoming calls, so we're having conversations with the people that want to.
Yeah.
And I think that if all we're doing is actually questioning the reasoning behind a belief, in the same way that truth is always a defense to slander, that's what we're engaged in. How much if somebody gives up their religion because of what I said, and they have negative consequences because of that, how much of that am I responsible for? This is something that I've considered quite a bit. What I find is that the people who end up suffering the negative consequences, the core problem there still goes back to religion. It's like if somebody told you when you're 30 you're going to inherit $1 billion, and you get to be 30 and you find out you're wrong. Now your life may be crap from that point on, because you may have lived as if you were going to inherit $1 billion and you didn't. You may have built up expectations and changed your fundamental perspective on the world, so that once it's not true, you're now miserable, maybe you're bankrupt and everything else. But it's not learning that you did not inherit $1 billion that was the problem. It was the false promise of $1 billion at the beginning that was the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I guess from your perspective as well as a Christian, Glenn, you don't want people to be Christians just because of the benefits it brings in terms of, you know, the community and the lifestyle and the psychological well-being. So you're interested in truth as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What if we found out the happiest way to be was just to be high on heroin all the time?
Right.
We do know there's
Rat in a cage with it.
we do know there's big negative consequences to that long term, so I don't think that's likely as a possibility.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it needs to be existentially grounded. I think it needs to be true in order to live out that life. Because, I mean, life is a wager. I am constantly, you know, I don't mean this in the religious sense at all. Life is an act of faith. Step out into the world not knowing what's going to hit me. Am I going to open myself out in a certain way that will make me vulnerable, that will make me weak, that will get me attacked, but in another sense it could help people. All of life is a venture of faith, and if it's not true, then I'm a fool. You know? And I think, you know, Christianity is a venture to be in Jesus and with Jesus, extending my arms out to the world the same way that he was in salvation love. If God is not on the other side of that, raising me up again, which is the Easter story, cross and resurrection, then I am to be pitied more than all men, which is what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So I absolutely think that we have common cause on this one. It must be true. But if it is true, I think that is what explains its workability.
Right.
You know, there are some people, I've done debates online with people who are very much atheists in the mold of Jonathan Haidt, David Sloan Wilson. And
You see the usefulness of religion.
right. It's metaphorically true. So that, which is true enough. And really the debates we seem to have had, they seem to have been saying, well, to live this way, i.e. in this moral way, works, therefore it's true. And I kept on saying, well, no, I think it's true, and therefore it works.
Right.
And I think that's where I come to with that brand of atheist. I do think you need to ground it in what is actually true about the world. But I think an inference to the best explanation for why it is that religion actually does work in the world is that it is true.
I mean, Matt says that you need to give secular humanism a chance. It hasn't had a long time to actually get going and create community, and potentially we will see all the same benefits accrue to someone who simply says, well, that's my way of finding meaning.
No offense.
Or maybe you would. Well,
I come pretty close. Okay. So one of the things is when Jordan Peterson and I sat down, I pointed out that there's never been a secular humanist government. He tried to say that the Soviet Union was, and he just doesn't understand what secular humanism is. That wasn't secular humanism. That was like state-enforced atheism, and was very much anti-religion. And so if we're going to use the language, we can certainly separate the types of things that we would put in a bucket as maybe it's a sense of awe. Maybe it's the notion that there's something that may be greater than the self that you might want to consider yourself with. I think so. I think there are concepts, truth and freedom. I think that the society that I benefit, that I'm also a part of, needs to be considered. You can't be myopic when you're looking at something like wealth. You just say, well, this benefits me. Who cares what it does to anybody else? Because we're intertwined. But there were a couple of to kind of go back to something that you mentioned. I would agree that if there were a God, or we'll stick with the Christian God so that we don't have to drag everybody else into it. But if there were a God, that would be a sufficient explanation for why some of these devout religious tendencies seem to be beneficial to the practitioner. In the same way that if there were a God, that would explain some of the things that creationists point to with regard to design. My concerns on this are separate. Yes, of course, that would be sufficient. But is it actually true? Because we've done this over and over again, where we make an inference to an explanation based on whatever limited knowledge and information we have right now. And then we find out later we got it wrong. And every time we found out later that we got it wrong, it was scientific exploration and discovery that found it wrong. And at no point have we ever found out we were wrong about a God.
What do you make?
Well, is secular humanism new? In one sense, yes, quite new. In another sense, I think I do think Nietzsche's critique holds that secular humanism tends to be Christianity where God is swapped out for God.
But to the extent that's true, couldn't we just say that Christianity is the Hammurabic code swapped out or upgraded or changed, or that all of this is derivative? At some point, we're talking about human beings and how they choose to try to answer the questions and live lives cooperatively. Whether you're going back to animism and some tribal struggle, then this becomes a more codified sort of language, and when people aren't paying attention to it and the village elder is no longer sufficient authority, we appeal to one outside of there. I mean, this would also be a sufficient explanation for the history of religion. So to say that secular humanism is a newly packaged, light, modified version of Christianity really isn't relevant if Christianity is a modified version of other things that all tie back to the human being.
Which is a big if, and I don't think it is at all. I think what you get when you look at human civilizations, what you get when you look at the Hammurabi Code, when you look at the Enuma Elish, when you look at any number of the ancient Near Eastern texts, when you look at any number of Greco-Roman understanding of the world, or Persian understanding of the world, or Muslim understanding of the world, it is basically that in the realm of the flesh, in the realm of biological reality, it is survival of the fittest, and therefore sacrifice the weakest. And I think what you get absolutely uniquely in Christianity is the reverse of that. You have in Christ the fittest who is sacrificed in the survival of the weakest. And what you get birthed out of the movement is a unique preference for the poor, the marginalized, the outsider, to draw them in, such that obviously in this society it's tit for tat, but cooperate against all that kind of stuff. But who is we? That's it. Let us cooperate. Who are the people on planet Earth who are actually saying it's actually all of us, even our enemies, are those who grants equal very marginalized, no matter how weak they are, no matter how ineffectual they are, no matter how maladaptive to survival they are ours, and grant them the universal humanity. That's the power of Christian. And it's not, it's Bible, so it's there in Judaism, but it's a uniquely Christian that I think secular humanism has taken on. But I don't think you can find that secular humanism anywhere else.
In Judaism.
That's good. Judaism.
Sure, let's credit the Abrahamic God with everything. And when I look at it, my issue is, if there is an Abrahamic God, okay, that's an important question, which I guess we're going to somewhat sideline, because at the end of the day, this notion that human beings who care about human beings are not going to come up with multiple different ways of structuring a society, and that some of those, which may be consistent with your view and understanding of Christianity, which I would argue is perhaps different than some other people's view and understanding, doesn't mean that this is Christianity light and modified and updated, or that it's all derived from Christianity as the original source, because that presumes that there's something other than human beings that are the original source for those ideas. The fact that they became popular within Christianity, that you have somebody talking about blessed are the meek, did that ultimately lead some people to the United Nations Universal Code of Human Ethics type stuff, secular humanism? Sure. Because we're all together on a planet and these ideas get passed around. And my take on it has always been, take the best ideas wherever you find them, get rid of the rest. And so from, the Bible, I can pull out some really good ideas and get rid of its support for slavery or genocide or misogyny. I don't have to hang on to the baggage or claim that I'm doing it because there's...
In a sense, though, you're getting rid of everything including God in the process of doing it. I mean, is your argument then that there's a danger in doing that? You can't simply have the ethics without some of the supporting foundations for you?
Which is Nietzsche's critique as well. Yeah, absolutely. But you get rid of the God of Christianity, and you must get rid of the ethics of Christianity as well, because it is founded on The God who took flesh, who became the weak one, in order to rise up again and bring us weak ones into his family. And he uniquely gives to the entire human race a dignity, which you can kind of secularize that term and call it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's basically the Imago Dei. That's basically the image of God.
So when, on one hand, you seem to be saying you can't remove God and still maintain these things, and yet you're claiming that secular humanism has done exactly that.
Secularism has done exactly that, or hasn't it?
Has done. That when I advocate the secular humanist principles, when I do that I'm basically taking the principles that you see in Christianity and just removing God. So clearly you can do that.
You can do that, but on what grounds now is every human being in the image of God, or now in this new updated term, is every human being now included in the universal?
Yeah, this is the thing that I keep running up against, is I have yet to find anybody presenting an objection to secular morality that is in any way solved by appealing to a religious one. The big thing that you get to is, well, what's the foundational source and why should I care about it? This is where when Sam writes Moral Landscape and people are like, well, you haven't fully explained well-being. Of course, we haven't. I mean, this is a process where we continue to discover things. Well, why should anybody care about well-being is the big question that Sam always gets asked. And that this question also applies to why should anybody care about what a God says? And this is one of the things where, whether or not there's a God, I don't necessarily see any evidence when I look at Christianity in particular, at least the way I understood it when I was a Christian, that there's a God who has human interests at heart. It's humans who have human interests at heart. So not only would secular humanists stand with our Dawkins razor, but the thing that we're appealing to is the very thing that we're seeking to do, which is we care about us. Why do we care about us? We care about us because we're us. Now, when you add in the God of Christianity, you get the notion that no, God's got a plan. You are a part of that plan. And, okay, he loves you and he's making a place to either torture you or rescue you too, and he can serve as a foundation that we can point to so that we don't have to think of ourselves. But nowhere in there is there any sort of guarantee that there either is a God, or B, that God has the actual best interests of humans at heart. It's just an appeal that God understands these things better than we do. And so when it seems like God doesn't have the best interests of humans at heart, that's just our failure to understand it, which is really fallacious reasoning.
Except that Christianity is about God the human. I mean, the foundation of Christianity is Christ. It's the foundation that God the Son has become God and brother to celebrate Christmas. It's the time at which the Word became flesh, which is just a stunning religious idea that is found nowhere else. Disgusting to my Muslim friends. It's disgusting to the Greco-Roman minds. And yet, the Christian claim uniquely is that God took flesh and even became a single cell in Mary's womb, became the weak and despised thing for the sake of all weak and despised things. And I think from there you get the principle that humanity in and of itself has a dignity because God has so dignified it. Otherwise, it's us elevating humanity to a certain position. Why should we elevate humanity to a certain position? Why should there be such a thing as human exception?
Why shouldn't there be?
That is the power play, right?
I mean, I'm not just asking that to like,
Yep. Do you have an answer? Like, what do you think?
I don't really see any reason why it shouldn't be. Well, of course we're going to be concerned about our own well-being. I mean, you talk about, there's
is that moral though? Or is that just powerful?
So this is the thing when we talk about what is moral. So that quite often we'll say, well, the thing you're describing, that's all well and good, but it's not morality. Fine, then I don't care about morality. You need to tell me what you're going to, because if the only thing you're going to do is some sort of, divine command or supernatural being that serves some grounding or whatever you want to do, that's not what I think anybody's ever really cared about morality. When we talk about morals, we talk about this, we're evaluating the consequences of our actions with respect to some goals, and does it ultimately increase, decrease, or have no effect on our well-being, which is why I think the sample of well-being, I didn't used to use that. I used a different language when I did my talk.
But you fundamentally agree with Sam Harris that that's something we can objectively measure through, say, scientific means, as long as we know what benefits, what generally humans want in their lives,
I think you can
know
do
the best way to
objective assessments, objective evaluations
And that is
with
the
respect to a
matter.
standard. You don't have an objective reason why you care about that standard, just like you don't have an objective reason why you care about it. If there was a God, it would come along and clarify all this. I would think that would be a duty. But the beautiful story you're talking about, where the most powerful being comes down and becomes a cell, becomes one of the weak, one of the fallen, in order to save them. That's an incredibly nice way to package it, but I have, I guess, a completely different take on it, because the story is a little different. The story starts in Genesis, where God creates everybody, and then it all screws up, and then he tries to fix it, and it screws up, and he tries to fix it, and it screws up. It's this parade, it's this comedy of errors. And then you get to a spot where God, who's been demanding that we slaughter animals and burn them because he likes barbecue, is now decided that he's going to come down and take human form and sacrifice himself to himself for a weekend to fix everything for everybody. That's blood magic. That is sacrificial blood magic thinking, and nothing to do about human value.
Do you actually believe that? What you just described as a summary of Christianity? Who actually believes?
How could
what
you
just
not?
said? Wait,
Did God come down and become human,
God the Son,
sacrifice
as I said,
himself?
God the Son became God our brother.
He's still God.
God the Son
Okay.
became God our brother. Right?
But
the Son
are
and
you
the
a
Father.
non-Trinitarian? Sorry.
That's precisely because I'm Trinitarian. God the Son
Right?
became God our brother, full of the Holy Spirit,
Okay.
in order to unite us as family back to the same source, back to the Father. That's
Okay.
just basic Trinitarian theology.
Did God not sacrifice himself?
The Father sent the Son.
But they're the same.
They're not the same.
They're part of the Trinity.
Yeah, they are definitely.
They are
part of it.
one, right?
They are definitely part of the
Are
triune.
they one, though?
They are united. Absolutely. The Father, Son, and Spirit.
United. I mean, we're united at a table, but we're not one.
The Father is in the Son, and the Son is in the Father. So that they are united on a level far superior to. But they are
Why
not
does
the
there
same
need to be a
person.
blood sacrifice?
Well, because to walk away from God, to be disconnected from God, is death, right? And in the Bible, the life is in the blood.
Well, who made that rule?
If God is the source
God
of
have done
life,
it differently.
well, if God is the source of life, and we reject life, what does that leave us with? Death. If God was not us, what would we do?
You're talking, first of all, you're speaking kind of metaphorically, because I'm not rejecting life. I'm rejecting the proposition that there's some eternal life, because I don't see sufficient evidence. There is, but God, this notion, why does there need to be a blood sacrifice at all? At some point, we're running around killing animals because God makes us smell of our flesh. Literally, it says that. Now, while it's, I know what I think what part of the objection is. It's like the Easter story when atheists will say, and then the zombies rose up and marched on Jerusalem. There's nothing about it. But it does talk about the dead getting up out of the grave. And so it's a colloquialism for zombies. I don't think even the atheists should, by and large, are thinking that we're talking walking dead here. But it's a shorthand to show that there's something that's potentially absurd here, extraordinary that doesn't have evidence. This isn't even that. This isn't even extraordinary. This is, to me, bizarre. What is it about killing something that God needs you to do in order for God to forgive you? Because if God is the creator of everything, He knows how this works. Couldn't He have done other things that don't exist?
Well, I mean, first of all, the priest has been out there. You would eat them. You would eat them. We still go to the butcher. We still sacrifice animals. And in that sacrifice, even today, in seconds, the death of that animal is our life. And in that very literal sense, that animal is. And it's just like in the Old Testament, it's also on top of that. It was a great conversation. On top of that, butchery, there was also a spiritual lesson being taught. And the spiritual lesson being taught was not that the blood of this bull is paying for your sin, but that there is a Messiah who is coming who will pay for your sins. Because, no, the blood of goats and bulls cannot pay for sin. But God can take responsibility for his handiwork. And God did take responsibility for his handiwork. And it was his job. That's the
I mean, I want to move us on from what is a very
Sure.
interesting theological debate at this point. It may move us back a bit to the central thesis of this
Sure.
whole thing. I mean, we've been asking, can atheism deliver a better world? We're talking about this in the context of morality now. First of all, from the outset, what do you say just to that question? We haven't even asked that yet. Can atheism deliver a better world? What's your sort of...
I have no idea. I've never suggested that atheism or even secular humanism guarantees a better world. First of all, we're always dealing with human beings. And so you can come up with whatever rule system you want. And it's like, I got a thing wrong on the show the other day. Somebody was talking about natural planet, and I confused it with the real method. There's nothing wrong with natural planet other than you have to actually follow it diligently, and it will result in having sex less often. And then within the Roman Catholic Church, they are required to just abstain rather than using alternate things. There's nothing. I'm not saying that secular humanism guarantees a better world, but even if we take what Glenn's saying, even if you were to look at this as Christianity light without the God bit, I would already view that as better because A, we guarantee that we have human best interests. That's humanism. It's the foundation of it. You can say, and you would be correct, that it's just a bold, bald assertion that we should care about humans. Okay? I have no response to that. I don't even know why anybody would want to come up with a response. There's nothing that says the world will be better this way, except for this. I did a debate in a Church of Christ where I told them I could write a better book than the Bible, and I could prove it to them. Because I could rewrite it word for word, reverse its position on slavery, and it would be a better book. Because for the people who are looking at this, not so much as metaphorical lessons or like that, if they're looking at this as an instruction book for life, that book advocates slavery. It's not even a question. If you were to say, thou shalt not own a human being as property, that would be better than saying you can, and that you can pass them on. And so this was the example I used for the people who are kind of like Bible worshipers, not the people who go in looking for, hey, this is an interesting message here, the second comes from life, but no, this is literally word for word. Well, that type of mindset is probably more responsible for the harm and damage that a lot of us do with Christianity than Glenn's version, for sure. I mean, I don't think Glenn's is pro-slavery at all. And when you start looking at things where you are finding a way to take a message that could easily be viewed as this is a blood-crushing sacrifice, and say, well, life has to consume life to exist, and you want to kind of maybe blow off why God would have made it that way or why it had to be made that way, which is a weird and interesting theological discussion. Getting rid of those things and keeping good things is all I've advocated for ever. And secular humanism, to me, is taking good parts, whether they're found in Christianity, Judaism, Scientology.
And who's deciding on the center? And the good is simply defined by the community regard as the method to the value.
Yeah.
Basically points us in that direction.
Yeah, and it's not fully defined or anything else. But to pretend that we don't have some beginning understanding of it, I think is a bit ridiculous.
So, so I think very briefly, in a sense, then we're sketching out this idea that there is a secular morality.
Well, there's an example that came along with this that Glenn produced when he was listing off societal health versus religiosity and teeing me up for the Gregory S. Paul thing. He mentioned divorce rates. But that comes with the presumption that divorce is a bad thing.
Sure.
And I don't believe that. I'm recently divorced. Me and my ex-wife are as good friends now as we ever were. And we're both in agreement that it was absolutely the right thing for us to do. And so what's happened here is, from my perspective, and obviously people who disagree, religious thinking, religious teaching, religious dogma has done a number of great disservices by setting up a notion of the soul, setting up the notion that marriage needs to be one man, one woman forever. That's caused countless problems. By setting up a view of death that does not allow people to deal with that. If we started with the notion that death is the eventual consequence of life, it would fundamentally change
and that was the end as far as we knew, and anything else would be a bonus, fundamentally changed, I think, how we treated people while they were still alive. And so there's a number of problems here that are rooted in the theology, rooted in the notion of there's God, which I think we can set those aside and just focus on the things that actually directly try to benefit human beings.
So it's all the benefits of Christianity plus a few more because you have to fight.
Well, Matt said that you could write a Bible that's superior to the Bible by a person's position of slavery. I think if you started from scratch without the Bible, I don't think you, and I don't think anyone has written a collection of Bible that has done what the Bible has done for slavery. Because slavery is a universal, and it has not been understood by other those So
Parts of it.
It's a longer discussion about how you take the Old Testament, but that's got to be interesting because we can't do it. There's no A/B testing.
Which I think kind of undermines what you were just saying. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm in agreement with you. You're viewing it as nobody else has done this and you don't think anybody else could. And my thing is, we have no way to find that out because we live in a world where this is the way things happen. And so to argue that you couldn't actually write a list of moral precepts from scratch that are superior to Christianity.
But then aren't you saying, at least with the Christian side, you've got, there is one group of people that has guaranteed take it far longer than the original one. There is one group of people who don't know if let's give it a go. Let's walk away from that has given us all these benefits. The universities, the hospitals, and the schools, the scientific method, emancipation of slaves, and all this sort of stuff. Let's walk away from that. That's quite a leap of faith.
And am I also getting the sense, Glenn, that I want to come back to this human at the centre of this, and the fact that Matt says, hey, humans are humans, and it's natural that we're going to prefer ourselves, and that's where the morality comes from, our own best interests. And you're saying, no, somehow Christianity has actually grounded an intrinsic dignity to the human that Matt's godless ethics isn't necessarily going to support. It might go in that direction for a moment, but there's no ultimate foundation to it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We are always going to look after ourselves, but who is we? Who are ourselves in that conversation? And we are always wanting to narrow the circle around us and our mates and exclude the other tribe and exclude the other people. So in the news here in the UK, just recently they brought in a non-invasive prenatal test for Down syndrome. And it had the reliable effect that everybody knew it was going to have. As people knew that they were going to have children with Down syndrome, they aborted them at ever higher rates. And yet the headlines said children with Down syndrome down 30%. And it sounded like it was a cure for Down syndrome. They hadn't found a cure. They just drawn a circle around humanity. Those with that much Down syndrome and eliminate. And that to me is very chilling of proceeding with humanism. That's always the danger. Like, who is us? Who are those who we are going to drag line to line? Who are those who we are going to say, they do not qualify? And it's always tempting to the humans to say, okay, it's the strong who will make the decision that we must take the hindmost. What is it that's going to stand up for all humans, regardless of capacity, regardless of attributes, regardless of achievements? Who is it who's going to stand up for all humans and actually be true humans and grant them?
This is the problem. So first of all, whether or not that abortion scenario that you're talking about is human or not is subject for a whole nother debate. But you say, well, nobody could do this. And then when we talk about, here's a list of precepts where we don't include God. then your answer is, now you're just borrowing from Christianity. It's Christianity light, you just remove God. And then the other objection that you're going to launch a second morality is, what's going to be the foundation beyond this? At least we have a foundation, it's God. Well, what if people don't accept your foundation? That is exactly the same objection that you are leveraging. You're launching at secular humanism. That whatever problem secular humanism may have with regard to foundations of evidence, no religious foundation has any way of solving that. Because ultimately, until some God comes in and says, I am in fact the God of the universe and I am the moral authority, and are forced to recognize that this is the case, then the only thing that's happening is Glenn's saying God is the foundation of morality and I'm saying humans are. And nobody is going to be, neither of those systems is going to work for people who don't accept that that's the foundation.
Do people have to all recognize this foundation in order for it to be the foundation?
No, people don't need to recognize that 2 + 2 = 4 for it to be the case that 2 + 2 = 4, and you need to go to your grave proclaiming that 2 + 2 = 4. Even if the whole world said it was otherwise, then 2 + 2 would still equal 4. People don't need to recognize truth.
Do if you're talking about a moral system. If you want to create, computer code and get people to start programming it, you've got to be able to convince them about ones and zeros. So 2 + 2 = 4 isn't even in the same ballpark of there is God. It's either true or it's not, but it's not a foundation for something. If you're talking about a moral system, the true foundation is agreement on what the foundation is, that the three of us care about human beings. And then we can start arguing about how much we care and where there's going to be conflicts and everything else. But as long as we can't do any of that until we agree on that foundation. And if Glenn's foundation is there's a God involved in this and he can't demonstrate that, then we're not even going to get started on solving the problem.
That's not what 2 + 2 = 4 is the analog of in this conversation. 2 + 2 = 4 is the analog of all human beings are worthy of provision for judgment. Do you agree with that? All members of the human family, no matter what their achievements, no matter what their actions, all members of the human family are worthy of all provision.
I have no idea.
That's a problem. It's definitely a problem, especially when you've got people who are discovering
When I say I have no idea, it's about that simplification. My instinct is, of course, to say yes. Thank you. That's a very atheist perspective. The answer is, of course, say yes. The problem is that when we start talking about the specifics of language, there are going to be rights conflicts that we have to address.
Sure. But all other things being, as a general principle, would you say that what Ben has laid down there is one that you can agree to? The importance of treating
Sure, in the general colloquial sense, yeah.
Yeah. And what's your point then, Glenn? That this 2 + 2 = 4, as it were, that this agreement, that doesn't exist just on the basis of Matt's preferences. It's a fact in the way 2 + 2 = 4 is a fact, as far as you're concerned.
Yes.
See, and that I don't
quite so
that
much
I
for
that
you.
I don't agree with. It is certainly there are things that we're going to agree on. That I don't know how you could ever demonstrate that this is in fact like true, like some intrinsic truth about the, like, for example, I think human lives have incredible value. I don't think they have any intrinsic value. I don't think the universe cares at all about human life. They have value because they have value to us.
Mm-hmm. And who's us?
Humans.
Mm-hmm. All humans?
Well, cognitive able humans
I
who are
suppose
able to
my
consider the proposition of whether or not they have value.
Which is the strong, and that's my problem, is that it becomes an ever-shrinking circle of humanity that we have. It's the strong who rule the weak.
Well, the characterization of evolution as being strong over the weak, I would argue isn't necessarily accurate, but it's also because there's no decision there. It's whatever survives, survives. And what is strong in one sense, a weakness may become a strength depending on the situation. That's what evolution is. It's not like, ooh, man, you weak, I'm going to kill you type thing. Maybe, for example, sickle cell anemia provides protection against certain things. And so while it may be under certain circumstances, there's a reason why animals develop camouflage and other changes. That's because
why in your view
environment.
was it wrong for, sorry to near the end of the program, why was it wrong for Hitler and the Nazis to, euthanize disabled people, that they felt were outside of their circle of humanity? What was the kind of...
I'm not convinced they considered them outside the circle of what they consider to be human. They had a view that these were somehow inferior humans. I think they would all acknowledge they were human, just that they were somehow inferior or less diverse. Yeah, race, things like that.
Race.
So it's one of those things where people say,
Because a lot of people would say Hitler was wrong about the fact there, whereas from what I'm wondering, like, and we're getting to the issue of is there this objective moral value of humanity?
but it reminds me of people who argue that, hey, slavery is really good for the slave owners. And so if you're a slave owner, you can look at this and say, hey, slavery is a good thing because it benefits me. The problem is that when you look at the larger picture, it's actually not necessarily good for the slave owner. And beginning to recognize that every member of society affects potentially every other member, fundamentally changes, and it shifts our in-group, out-group dynamic. So that when Hitler goes after the Jews for whatever religious reasons he had, for whatever superior, uber guy reasons he had, that's fundamentally different from whether or not killing them makes society worse or better. And it's kind of this thing of, oh, this is what I think makes us better, which is independent from what actually makes us better. Nobody, not Sam nor I, anybody, is suggesting that if we begin with an agreement on well-being as a foundation, that there aren't going to be things that we think we have the right answer and find out we were wrong.
At that stage, then, it would seem like instead of having World War II, we would have a symposium in which the Nazis would present their papers and others would present other papers, and then we'd have a panel and discuss them and thrash it out. At what stage do you say that their vision for updating, for evolving, for having a master race, at what stage do you say that is morally justified and therefore just war formula?
I don't know that there's an answer for that apart from assessing the individual situations, which is what we did. But we didn't have to rely on God for it.
Well,
we
relied on 1939 years of Christian understanding of what is the sacrifice of Israel for the protection of it. And it was doing exactly the opposite. And so it was very obvious to people in that sense the evil of justice.
Sure. So it was Christianity that was the credit in Nazi regime. Not even Judaism.
It was Christianity that shaped the West and its moral sensibilities, such that Nazism appears as very obviously the very reverse of the way of the cross.
So this is something that you just can't argue with, because it's just an assertion from Glenn's perspective, because if we come up with something that is good, we're borrowing from Christianity. There's no way to not be accused of borrowing because Christianity was around before. And if you find something that was before Christianity, well, that was foreshadowing Christianity. Because the God that he believes in has been there forever. Mm-hmm. So anything true and good that was pre-Christ was God foreshadowing it. And anything is after, it's somebody borrowing from it. There's no response to this. And there's also no way for him to demonstrate that that's what's happening.
Is that a fair criticism, Glenn?
Well, I think we've said from Old Testament to New Testament, we've said from Genesis 1, I totally believe in the same God from the beginning. But I think what is the unique thing about the Christian story is you've got the sacrifice of the fittest and the weakest. You've got this way of the cross. You've got this way of